This morning we have Advanced ARM Exploitation with Stephen and special guest. So please give a round of applause and enjoy the talk.
Thank you. All right, so that was a pre-introduction, and we'll introduce ourselves individually also. So, as he said, we're Stephen and Stephen. We run a blog called Don't Stuff Beans Up Your Nose. We'll give you a little background about us, because you probably never heard of us before. We're former co-workers. We used to work with each other at a defense contractor doing InfoSec stuff, and now we do this blog together and blog about computer stuff and InfoSec stuff. A little bit about me. I'm an independent security researcher right now. I was formerly a director of information security at a bank until a couple months ago. And before that, I was also independent. But then before that, I worked at Matasano, and prior to that, McAfee and a defense contractor. Was a founding member of Kenshoto and did all the CTFs and stuff with them, and Seesaw and all that kind of stuff, and I do talks and stuff all around. Lawler, on the other hand.
Is this cool? Currently, I'm basically an independent security researcher. Prior to this, I was on Mandiant's malware analysis team. Obviously, we worked together doing defense stuff. I used to write sonar simulators for a living, specialize in kernel development, software exploitation, vulnerability analysis, blah, 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 blah.
And as you can tell, he's very enthused about everything. Anyway. So then we have a special guest also, George Wachowski from CrowdStrike.
Thanks for having me. So my name is Georg Wachowski. I work as a security researcher at CrowdStrike, and those guys were nice enough to invite me here to share some of the exploit techniques that I've been using on Android recently.
Cool. So, so we're going to talk about software exploitation on ARM, which we know runs on iPads, iPhones, pretty much every mobile platform. But we'll give you a little background about how we got into this stuff first. We did a talk last year called Hardware Hacking for Software People, which was kind of like, it was just more fun, basically, like little things you can do to mess around with hardwares and PICs and ICs and stuff. But that's actually was the impetus for us getting into this ARM and embedded stuff, because with those debug interfaces that we started to find on hardware, we started to see bugs and crashes and stuff, and the next step is obviously exploitation. So we wanted to learn about ARM a little bit. So then we'll talk about the background, and then we'll actually give you some of the information about the class that we actually ended up developing. We'll talk about some of the unique research, I guess, we came up with doing ROP on ARM, and like some really interesting exploitation techniques that we developed. We didn't really see it publicly demonstrated before, so we'll talk about that. So first things first, this is kind of what got me started. I started reading a lot of like electronics blogs and stuff, and seeing cool people take apart Nintendo DSs and stuff. It's like, what is this? I know nothing about it. I studied physics. I didn't even do computer stuff. So this stuff was interesting to me. I had basic E&M skills. So I started looking into it, doing a little reading. And the thing I wanted to learn is how all these chips and stuff communicated, and did a little research and basically found out that there are a lot of standard interfaces. Like what looks like chaos down on a PCB is actually really standardized. There's like I2C, there's microwire, there's SPI, there's all these interesting little serial protocols, and you can interface with them. And they're, from a security standpoint, there's a lot of inherent trust in the PCB. So like you can have EEPROM talk to a controller via a very standard serial protocol that you can tap. So I started doing that. I started tapping these buses and listening to what these little chips were talking to each other and saying. So this is the kind of stuff that uses these protocols. I started finding these things in batteries, temperature monitors, bus controllers, everything. I started seeing all this stuff pretty much everywhere. And then I started talking to friends about it. And I think last year Charlie Miller did a talk on I2C and MacBook batteries. And I helped him out with some of that work, because it turns out that your MacBook talks to your battery via I2C. So we did a little work on that kind of stuff. So then, of course, finding it everywhere, I started making it relevant to my InfoSec research. So I started finding these debug interfaces in routers, and one other cool place that is found is inside of VGA. Your monitor talks to your computer via I2C across the VGA bus, which is cool, and you can tap it. So I started seeing it everywhere. And so I let loose on a cable modem, found these exposed pens, interfaced to the pens using my hardware techniques, which I'm not going to get into today, but and then watched the thing boot. Saw it had a ECOS real-time operating system, and then started some fuzzing, and then boom, right? Started seeing bugs. And this happened on a lot of different appliances. Started seeing lots of cool crashes. What next? So that's when we started getting into learning more about embedded platforms and reverse engineering on embedded platforms. My machine's x86. All my exploitation experience is x86. Same with Steve. And we were kind of excited to learn something new. So first things first is we built a lab based on QEMU to simulate the ARM hardware. We got comfortable with our tool change, GDB, and looking at disassemblies in IDA and stuff like that. And then we started writing vulnerable apps. The first thing you're going to do when you want to learn exploitation is you write sample code snippets. You maybe open Mark Dowd's book or John Viega's book, and you look at insecure code samples, you compile them, disassemble them, and you start to actually figure out how to exploit them. So we did that on ARM. And then so we started developing these techniques and actually writing shell code and trying to make our exploits work. And we ran into a lot of problems with QEMU along the way, and we wanted a real hardware platform to run. And we'll go into a little bit maybe later about why it's better to have the bare metal, aside from just bling factor. So we looked around for a hardware platform, and we didn't really find anything that was great. Like phones are pretty annoying to use and interface with. It's difficult to build your tool chain for, kind of like Android and kind of weird Linux-based operating systems and stuff. We found a few kind of open hardware platforms, just like Raspberry Pi, which is really popular now. The Beagle board, the ARM Mini, there's just a whole bunch of these different ARM-based boards. And the one we landed on was the Gumsticks. It was a really open, it was a really mature developer community around it, so we went with that. There were kernel modules, people were constantly making patches and stuff, so we went with the Gumsticks. And the Gumsticks are pretty cool because they're just like little tiny, really low power PCs that have an ARM chip. And they're also like standard Linux builds and stuff that you can get for them, and you can just download ISOs and DD them to a little micro SD card, and you're up and running. So this is the board we ended up getting. It's a ThumbEE development board. We got the Gumstick Swatter computer on module, or COM, and it slots into the ThumbEE. And then we started buying a lot of these things because obviously we wanted to use them ourselves, and when we eventually taught the class, we wanted everyone to be able to use one. So then all of these sample little bits of code that we wrote while we were learning about exploitation ourselves, we realized we could just turn into lab exercises for a course. And so we did that. So we built out kind of a progression of exploitation, so like simple stack overflows, all the way up through kind of heap exploitation. And then we did a lot of the protection mechanisms after that, so like XN and ASLR, and we eventually bypassed all of those. So that's a little bit about what we'll talk about. So then word got out about the research we were doing and kind of the class we were putting together, and we had a few offers, so we took a few contracts to get some real-world experience, and we wrote some exploits, and then things just really started to develop, and we put all this kind of information in, cleansed it a little bit, and built this really, really big course. The course is basically 3 to 5 days, and we did it a very compressed version here at Black Hat, a 2-day course, like an intensive kind of thing, where we just jumped right into Stack Overflows and XN and stuff like that. But the natural progression is about 3 to 5 days. It's about 900 slides across 15 to 20 lectures. We have about 20 to 25 hands-on exploitation things. We have a 100-page lab manual with a bunch of ARM notes, IDA gotchas, GDB gotchas, just really interesting stuff. And then we wrote a lot of C code, obviously, not just the lab exercises, but we wrote helper libraries to help you build your ROP payloads, for instance. We'll talk about the ROP stuff later, but we went through and found 35 ROP gadgets and built a ROP library so you can just chain together your what you want, and you're off to the races. So what the course teaches is basically how to reverse engineer ARM binaries, how to debug ARM binaries, ELF specifically, how to exploit stack overflows, how to defeat XN. We do heap overflows, we do stack pivoting. We found some awesome pivoting gadgets, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, how to defeat ASLR, all that kind of stuff. So we first debuted this course publicly at CanSec West, and it sold out, which was really amazing. So, and then after that course, we had a lot of people follow up with us. People took home the hardware, and because the really nice thing about this platform is that because it's all on one piece of hardware that you can just plug into your home network and just SSH into, your whole tool chain is right there. So on your work machine, all you need is an SSH client, and then you SSH into your lab environment. You got GDB, you pick up right where you left off. And we added some other features in there, like read-only file systems, so you can't screw yourself up, and like a lot of little interesting things. So people were really excited about that. We got a lot of positive feedback, and then we said, well, maybe we'll try this thing at Black Hat, and then we offered it at Black Hat, and it sold out. So it's like it was really surprising, and it's been really nice. This is the lab set up at CanSec West, and we gave all these machines away to the students so they could take it home and do this stuff. But one interesting thing about the popularity of this course is that it really shows us that there's a desire not only to learn this stuff, but that we're also transitioning. This is kind of me on my InfoSec podium right now, if I can, for just a second. We're kind of transitioning into the post-PC exploitation environment. It's interesting. Phones are more interesting. Like if you want to get information, or as a target in general, like it's always with you, it's always on, it's internet connected, it's got a modem inside of it, it's got a GPS unit. I mean, it's more interesting than the machine that you leave on your desk for 8 hours a day. So it shows that we're definitely moving into a new world, and we were kind of really happy to see that kind of response, and it's nice for us to be positioned to share this information with the community. And so now into the actual information. So we'll share a little bit of the interesting stuff that we developed for the course. Specifically, we'll talk first about ROP on ARM, just kind of in generic terms, and how we defeated it in our lab environment, or how we defeated XN using ROP in our lab environment, and how you could kind of use the same techniques to defeat code signing or whatever. And then we'll have George come up and talk about his experience with ROP specifically on Android for a specific bug that'll get demoed later on today. So, you want to do this? We can just tag team it? Okay. All right.
So why would you give a crap about ROP? I think since 2008, everyone pretty much knows why ROP is important. Prior to 2008, I think no one really knew. So, but we'll go over it briefly. The reasons are, XN, execute never, so you can't execute code off the stack or heap anymore. So how do you get around that? How do you build a payload that can still exploit someone when you cannot actually exploit shellcode? And the answer is ROP. Code signing, if you have some annoying platform that just insists on dictatorial control over all code on the system, then you have to somehow bypass that. So the general idea behind ROP is you're going to bounce out of a lot of bounce points all over existing text regions from a legitimate computer program. And what you want to bounce out of is little snippets of code and the terminology that people use nowadays. I used to just call this ret to libc, but now, we have special terms for everything. So
He's so salty.
You find code sequences that end in an indirect branch. Ideally, they reference parameters and data off the stack, and ideally, the indirect branch is loaded from the stack. You'd like everything to be as stack-based as possible so that you can just crap your stuff onto the stack and then just start ropping away. Just, blah, 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 return, blah, 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 return, blah, 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 return. And each gadget basically, it has to do something useful. What does useful mean? Well, it means useful to you, the exploit developer, and it has to have an indirect branch. And usually it has to be, say, like at most 7 to 10 instructions before it does the indirect branch. Because if you're going to execute a gadget that executes 2,000 instructions, the odds that you or a magical artificially intelligent solver will be able to keep track of all the constraints on that code and make sure that it doesn't explode before it actually does the indirect branch is virtually nil. So usually you just stick to 3 to 5 instructions ending in an indirect branch. That's a gadget. And the gadget is just a pointer to somewhere in like libc or kernel 32 or whatever and you just put a bunch of gadgets on the stack, one after the other. Their addresses.
So just to make it relevant to those who aren't like kind of the uninitiated, basically the synonym we're using for ROP, I think Dino came up with it because someone's girlfriend over some beers said something. When he was explaining ROP to her, she said, oh, it's kind of like a ransom note. I remember back in the day, like the Murder, She Wrote days, like people would snip bits of magazine to make sentences so that they couldn't do handwriting recognition and find out who the bad guy was. That's kind of what we're doing, is that we're using bits of code that already exist in the process space, pointers, like Steven said, to existing code, to piece together an execution path that does what we want. But it's not code that we wrote, it's code that we're using natively in the process. So that's a gadget. A gadget is a little snippet, basically.
Right. So one of the things that you'll immediately learn when you're trying to do ARM exploitation is that even if you want to do like regular old return to libc, right? I just want to return to system and pass him the string bin.sh so that he'll just execute bin.sh, right? You actually just can't even do that on ARM without doing ROP. Because unlike on x86, where all the parameters are on the stack, you have return address and then parameters on the stack, and then another return address and parameters on the stack. On ARM, you need to load the parameters into registers. So it is a necessity that you have gadgets that will load your parameters into registers and then bounce to another gadget which loads another parameter in a different register and then bounces to a gadget that will bounce to the function that you want to call. So even if you want to do a really simple return to libc that would be like 3 D words on a stack in x86, in ARM it could easily be, depending on what gadgets you have available, like 12 D words on the stack.
The reason for that is basically the calling convention on ARM is to pass everything in registers, kind of like fast call on x86. So that's why you have to pass parameters in registers, because there's basically no other way to do it on ARM.
Yeah. So in our class, though, I mean, occasionally you get lucky with gadgets. Like here's an example, libc plus 918DC. You'll find this gadget, I think, in just about every glibc implementation. It's from the GNU something something mcount function, and it's a function that's used to assist in gprof, if I remember correctly, the profiling stuff. And what it does is it hooks functions and then calls a profiling function and then calls back to the original function. So in order to do that, it has to save the original volatile registers that were passed to the original function on the stack somewhere, and then when the profiling function is done, pop them off the stack and return. So this is an example of a gadget that helps you do return to libc really easily. It's going to pop 4 parameters off the stack. On ARM, those are the first 4 parameters of any function, which is usually suffices for just about any regular old C function. It's going to branch a function address into R12. It's going to pop LR off. LR is the ARM equivalent of the saved return address. It's on ARM, it goes in a register. It doesn't automatically go on the stack. And then it'll branch to that function. So for example, this gadget plus parameters, the function you want to call, and then the next function suffices to do simple return to libc on ARM if you're exploiting an ARM platform that uses glibc.
So to back up a little bit, basically what we're attempting to do is just demonstrate to you at a high level, our technique is to basically defeat NX by calling a function called mprotect. And mprotect is basically going to, like virtual protect on Windows, change the page permissions. So we want to make sure that the region of memory we're trying to execute out of is actually executable. So our attempt is to use this ROP chain to try to change the permissions of memory. So we're going to try to call mprotect. And we're going to demonstrate how difficult just calling mprotect is using ARM and how we kind of got around it. So,
so actually in this example, just calling mprotect is easy. For example, this ROP chain, we'll get to that, would pop, this ROP chain would call mprotect on a stack address and then jump into it. So if you're exploiting like a regular old Linux router with no ASLR, you could just change the page permissions on the stack, make it executable, and then bounce into it. And the way it would work is first he would pop off 4008 BO8DC. That would go to this little gadget that then pops that stack address, BDFFDOO, into R0. That's the first parameter to mprotect. 2000, that's 2 pages, second parameter to mprotect. 7, that's the awesomest page permissions in the world. That would be the third parameter to mprotect. R3, we don't care what that is, so it's crap, dead beef. Then the address of nprotect, and then we say put into LR BDFFD100. We're going to pretend that's where our NOP sled is on the stack. So that would call mprotect and load LR with the address of the stack, so that when mprotect is done doing its thing, it will return to the stack, and then we can just dump shellcode there. But we're going to show how much more complicated this gets when you want to do what is a seemingly trivial thing. Let's say we wanted to call, let's say we don't exactly know where our shellcode is in memory, okay? And so we want to use mmap to allocate readable, writable, executable memory. And we know, just pretend that where the exploit occurs, we know R6 points to our shellcode in the heap somewhere. We don't know exactly where it is, we just know R6 points into the heap. So we want to copy whatever's from R6 into the buffer returned by mmap, and then we want to jump into the buffer. So if you want to do this in like C, or like pseudo C, it'd be like 3 lines of code, buff equals mmap, memcopy, buff, comma, R6, if R6 was accessible directly through C, but it's not, and then a function cast on buff to just jump into it. It would be super simple. So it should be easy in ROP, right? Oh. So first, mmap takes 6 arguments, not just 3 or 4. So we can't just load a bunch of stuff into R0 to R3. That's actually pretty easy to get around because we could use, for example, that gadget we just showed you that loads the registers off the stack, R0 to R3, and subsequent arguments just go after that on the stack. And so you just, so we can just put that gadget there, the gadget R0, R1, R2, R3, pointer to mprotect. LR would have to be another gadget that would pop 2 more things off the stack and then do pop PC, and then put argument 5 and 6 right after that. That's not insurmountable. So step 2, to call memcopy to copy our shellcode over. But wait, how do we move with ROP R6 into R1? Because we have to take R6, the register we know our shellcode is in, and move it into R1 so that it's the source argument of memcopy. And while we're doing this, we have to make sure that R0, which was the return address from mmap, doesn't get trashed. Because if we lose R0, we don't know where our executable buffer is anymore. So how do you do that?
So if you had some semantic solver, like a lot of people have that are scientists, like real computer scientists, then you could probably write something that would actually solve for this and actually find the gadgets you need. But we actually had to do it manually. So these are the gadgets we found.
So I searched through libc for a while, and I found a few gadgets. So here's one, the one at the top, Ludemia R3, R0, R1, R2, R3. So that loads from the pointer at R3 4 D words into the registers R0 to R3. He then writes those right back out to R4. He branches. After he branches, he trashes R0 with R5. That's a shame. Pops 2 registers off the stack and branches to LR. The second one is just like 2 bytes later. It's the same thing. He just writes to R4. So we could think of the first gadget as being read from memory and the second gadget as being write to memory. The first gadget, the caveat being there that the address you read from has to, well, that you also need to have a dummy memory location in R4 to write to, right? And then we find a few other gadgets, okay? One of them moves R6 into R0. One of them loads a value into LR off the stack and jumps into it. One of them just loads a value into R4. One of them loads a value into R3. One of them is a ROP NOP, that pop PC. That's like a NOP in ROP. It does nothing. It just moves on to the next instruction or the next ROP instruction. And the last one moves R0 into R3 and branches to LR. So obviously we're done at this point. We're done. Owned. So you can do this, like for example, if you want to move R6 into R1, it only takes about 14 easy steps. I'm not going to belabor all of these steps right here, I just want to say that the point with ROP is, at least in my experience, you're trying to find gadgets, and you end up with a bunch of, can you use 4-letter words here? Yeah, you end up with a bunch of shitty gadgets that suck, and none of them do what you want them to do. And they always do something annoying, like that first gadget there, he trashes R0. Thank you very much. Why? Why did you do that? And you have to work around it, and because you have to work around it with the gadgets that you have available to you, you end up with a 14-step process to do something incredibly trivial that would literally take one regular assembly instruction. So we just screw around with this and blah, 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 blah. We just sit in a Python script, like manually pasting hexadecimal values into a big buffer that we're going to send to our own process, and you end up with that. That does it. You pop a bunch of registers, you call mmap, you clean up the stack, you load LR with a PopPC, blah, 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 and eventually you get down to your memcopy, and you can then you can branch into R0, and you are an elite hacker.
So we found most of those gadgets manually and then stitched them together to do just that example, and it was a lot of painstaking work. So we originally did it manually, like opened a hex editor and just like wrote hexadecimal values in and pasted it onto the stack and see if the chain would go, and just did it over and over and over and over again. But that's hard and it's painstaking, so we, for the purposes of the course, wrote a library that bundles a lot of those individual gadgets together that you can use like kind of high-level classes to chain these gadgets together. So just you use like a generic class instantiation, and then you can just kind of, with these kind of reserve words that we gave, like load and branch to LR, and then it'll build your payload for you with some simple arguments. So that's what the students in the class actually used to build their raw payload, so they didn't have to do it manually like we did when we first started out. So here's, let's double talk this. So there are there are a couple different things we're going to talk about, and this is some of the interesting stuff that we found along the way. One of them is finding gadgets. So we found that there's some really unique things about ARM specifically that make exploitation easier because of the gadgets you can find.
Right, and we refer to, I guess, the technique we use as misaligned instructions, and that is a misnomer. That's why it's in quotes, because there is no such thing as misaligned instructions on ARM. All ARM instructions are aligned on half-word boundaries, to use ARM parlance, 16 bits if you're in Thumb or Thumb2 mode, and 32 bits if you're in ARM mode. So I remember reading a paper about someone talking about ROP on ARM. I don't know where it was. It was from some university. And they were like, well, probably finding pivots and stuff on ARM is a lot harder because unlike on x86, where there is no alignment, you can't have misaligned instructions. And I thought,
Bullshit.
That's bullshit. Exactly. So, because it's an example, right? Like pop R0 PC, that's a pretty cool gadget because it lets us load a value into R0 very easily. But if you think for about 5 seconds, how often would a compiler emit pop R0 PC in compiled code? Never. Because why would you need to save a volatile register across function calls? You wouldn't. So he would never want to restore the saved value of R0. Maybe if it was a return value, but if it was a return value, he'd probably move. It'd be a move from some other register into R0. He wouldn't just be popping it off. So how can you get gadgets like that?
Before we talk about that, we're going to just mention, he mentioned Thumb, ARM, and...
yeah, we're going to go over this just a moment.
So they're different. So the unique thing about ARM is that it can run in different instruction modes, unlike x86, I guess extensions are kind of like different instruction modes, but whatever. ARM has the different instruction modes, but what's interesting about it is that you can switch dynamically to them on the fly based on what instruction is in the instruction pointer. So there are 3 major modes, actually
2 major modes. And like
2 we care about, 4 modes total. So there's ARM mode, which is 32-bit. Thumb mode, here, you do Thumb mode.
Oh, yeah, here. I just want to reference one other thing on the ARM mode side. So we said there's ARM mode and Thumb mode, okay? So here's ARM mode. And how do you get the processor into ARM mode? How do you convince it to switch to ARM mode? The answer... What's talking about right here? Okay. The answer is, right down at the bottom there, if any of those instructions load PC where the low order bit is clear, you're in ARM mode now.
So yeah, Thumb mode is in contrast to ARM mode, which is 32-bit. Thumb mode is 16-bit mode, fixed width, and then there's Thumb 2, which is kind of like a spin-off of that, which was later. It allows for you to access 32-bit instructions from 16-bit mode, which is something that we actually found useful.
But they are still 16-bit aligned.
Yeah, so that's actually very useful. So then there's another mode called ThumbEE, which is like some stupid thing with those old feature phones. Like we would play like Java games, but no, that's something different. Anyway, ThumbEE.
And
oh shoot, that's supposed to say Giselle. There's one other mode called Giselle mode where ARM chips can actually natively execute Java bytecode. That is probably a whole interesting realm of research for someone else to do because that shit would be hard. So
here's where we talk about this concept of misaligned instructions, right?
This is pretty cool. We like this. This is really
so do you see a pop R0 R2 PC in here? No.
Yeah.
But scroll over. Yeah. So if we undefine that instruction, I'm gonna go back. Notice that I don't know if you can see it super well. That B.W lock 35F1A. That's a Thumb 2 instruction. So it's a 32-bit wide.
It's a branch to that.
Yeah,
function.
a branch to that. So he's just branching somewhere. If you undefine it, you can see it's a 4-byte instruction. But what if we branched to 3050E? Excuse me, 3050F, because we would want the processor to be in thumb mode when he got there. We'd say branch to 3050F.
Raise it by raising the
The processor would go, sweet, the low bit set. I will branch to 3050E.
Right.
And switch myself into thumb mode.
Right.
And what do you get?
Booyah.
You get pop R0, R2 PC.
Yep.
So that's how you get cool gadgets on ARM.
Yep. Flex. Oh, what's up? So cool. So then we do this, and then we do some, we show the students a lot of other different ROP tricks. And we'll just talk about a couple of those. The first one is when you're writing ROP and just shellcode in general, it's nice to have places to do scratch space, especially with ROP, because sometimes the gadgets you'll find will like need to shit stuff out to memory somewhere. Like you'll do an exchange or kind of a litum IA or something, whatever. Yeah. And then it's going to need to actually write to memory. And you need a place that's kind of like safe to just kind of put garbage into. And so Steve actually found this technique. So
I don't know if you can call it a technique. I mean, basically, you find some place that it doesn't matter if you trash memory.
Yeah, I was trashing globals, and sometimes my shit would just crash. So he did
this. And the easiest way to do that is you're like, okay, if I know that we're talking about libc here, but it could be whatever module you've memory leaked or whatever. You're like, I know his BSS or his data is E1528 bytes long, but the OS always it can't just allocate E1528 bytes worth of stores, virtual memory. It's always at least a page. So you know that you have like, however many bytes that is, E2000 minus E15. That's you can do whatever you want there. No one will touch that. You don't have to worry about accidentally trashing a global variable or some critical region of the heap and crashing the process during your ROP.
Yeah, that's a really useful trick. So that's one trick we teach. The next one is I don't know what this one is.
Yeah. So like here's just an example, right? If you don't have gadgets that will say directly move R2 to R1 or R3 into R2 or R1 into R3, how do you work around that, right? If you just couldn't find a gadget like that at all, well, if you have other gadgets that can read and write from memory, you can always write your registers out to your scratch space and then subsequently have another gadget that will read from that memory location into the register you want. So if you need to transition R7 to R2 and you can't find anything that will move R7 to R2, you can always find something that will transition R7 to something to scratch space to something else to the register you want. Yeah. So even if you think you can't get the gadgets you need, if you're creative enough, you usually can. And taking advantage of memory reads and writes is a good way to do that.
So if you had a solver, you could probably just do this automatically, but we don't because we ghetto styles.
I'm down on solvers too. I'm not a big solver guy.
Yeah, I went to the MIT SMT convention thing, and I just sat there and drooled the whole time. I didn't understand a damn word that was said there. And I didn't feel bad because Charlie Miller was like, yeah, that shit's stupid anyway. So, right on. So then there's a third trick we teach. This is just a little ASCII trick.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, this is not even a trick. Like, if you really understand computers, this isn't a thing. But, you know, if you're like, oh, how am I going to build an ASCII string, or how am I going to build a sock adder structure, or how am I going to build a you know, whatever, fake certificate in memory? Well, like, whatever, just
Treat it as a pointer.
yeah, treat it as pointers and values. You find your gadgets that you need to just write D words to memory, and if you can just paste whatever you want in memory and create, you know, obviously whatever kind of data structure in memory you need to get the job done, even if you can't find a ROP gadget that will do stir copy for you.
So we use a lot of these techniques, and then in our course, basically by the last day, our students are building their own ROP payloads. They actually build a full connect back root shell ROP payload to defeat a remote heap overflow and XN ASLR on those gum sticks. So these things are real, and people are actually learning this stuff. And I'd like to play a new game, which is How Bored is George right now? But you got to get up anyway and talk about ROP on Android. So a lot of the techniques we talked about, we found out even cooler people were really using in the real world, not on little gum sticks.
All right. Hope you can hear me well. So or rather, Jonathan Drake, Ecovent's Jonathan Drake, and I were doing an exploit for Android 4.0.1, which we're going to demo in Miller's talk later today. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit of the techniques that we used there, specifically the ROP. So what did we use? Yeah, what we tried to use was we took the shittiest bug from WebKit that could be out there, which is really, really hard to exploit, and we still try to exploit it, right? So it is a really, really neat exploit because it's such a shitty bug. So let's get just right into it, right? It's a use after free vulnerability in the WebKit render arena, which there's like tons out there, some 1 day, some 0 day. So if you have a methodology for exploiting render arena bugs, you're golden, because I mean those are really, really hard bugs, but once you know how to understand how to exploit them, there's a lot of them. So this is really hard to read for me and probably for anybody else too. So we hijack a virtual function pointer. That's just the easiest C exploitation thing you can do. It's straightforward. And so the very first call side, which you can see there, really, really sucked a lot, because data that we control is at dereference register R0 plus hex 17C, which is pretty hard to pivot to. So what do? Well, we try to hijack another call site. So instead of starting some lead ROP chain there, we just point this virtual function pointer to a BXLR, which is like a return. So we just ignore that we're being called there. We're not even taking control there. Okay, so we get to another call site, and that's kind of like the first trick. If it's really hard to pivot from the call site, we don't need to control PC, right? Just return. So second call site looks a lot nicer if you can read it, if you've got like, I don't know, really good glasses. So on the second call side, because the virtual function pointer table gets dereferenced into a volatile register, which is R2 here, we actually control the data at R2 plus 17C. And on x86, that might be like a doable mission, right? So you could add something and then point the stack pointer to do that. And we tried really, really hard to find a pivot gadget using those misaligned instruction technique. I just call it misinterpretation of mode technique. There's probably some academic name for it too. And we tried really hard, and we had no real tools. We just had a crappy Python script that parses object dump output, which is not really a tool, right? And we didn't find a pivot gadget for that. So that was really sad. We did this awesome return trick, and still no good. But we found a really, really nice master pivot gadget in the linker. So the linker has to, you just got to download the slides, and then you can steal all the gadgets if you cannot read them now. It has to deal with exception handling, exception unwinding, and so on. And that's why the linker in Android contains this really nice register, which is called restore core registers, right? And it takes a buffer from R0, adds hex 34, and it pops later on stack pointer, link register, and program counter from there. That's like ideal. That's what we want. So this worked almost great for us, because R0 is the this pointer in this case where we hijack it, And even though the fully user-controlled data was in the vtable, it was possible to hijack something in this pointer as well, get some user-controlled data in there, which, since we're in the render arena, was actually CSS values. So the exploit has like nice CSS that has some pixel values in decimal that actually map to addresses, because that's how it's going to end up. So we almost control that, except that our control starts at hex 38 instead of hex 34. So we're just like one word misaligned. But luckily, this awesome function, restore core registers, which takes the argument in R0, is also called from other sites. And those other sites load like the location from R5 or R4 and add 4 to it. And with the call site magic we did and so on, we actually found a call site after returning once that has our stuff in R5. Then 4 gets added to R5. That gets moved into R0, and our awesome pivot gadget is being called. So it's kind of a like bigger gadget thing. Normally, you don't want to do anything that calls anything and then returns from that. But in this specific case, the function doesn't really return. It just pops the program counter, and that's how we take control, right? So that's the awesome thing about the linker. I mean, the one thing that why we use as a linker is they forgot, they didn't randomize the linker in 4.0, which is, we don't need even an info leak. And the other thing is, even if you need an info leak on 4.1, it's always really great to use a linker because it's full of such awesome gadgets, right? That are even compiler generated in there that are meant to be there. Okay, so we have kind of the pivot gadget. And now how are we pivoting? This is like copied from the exploit. It's maybe hard to read, but it says like bottom margin of this element is this, which is the program counter. Then there's the top margin, which is going to be the link register. And then there's the right margin is going to be the stack pointer. That's really funny. So what did we set those values to? Well, so as I've said, it's CSS. And the thing with CSS and WebKit is the high nibble will be cleared, which is how WebKit handles CSS stuff. It actually handles some flags in the high nibble there. So we cannot have the high nibble set. And the linker has the high nibble set. But what is the other thing that does not get randomized in Android? Yeah, it's the base executable itself. They don't have position-independent executables, which is great. There's a pop PC instruction in there. There's a BXLR instruction in there. So we point the PC, because we're in R mode right now, we point it to a BXLR. We point LR to a thumb mode pop PC instruction, and then we actually are doing our ROP. So what are we setting the stack pointer to? Well, we need to have an absolute value. So what do you do if you not really lead with ROP? Yeah, you do some heap spraying. So the ROPs actually sprayed onto the heap with ROP knob slabs, ROP slats. I don't know how those are called, but there's like a lot of pop PC words on the stack followed by our actual ROP chain. And we can actually now use ROP gadget that end either in PopPC or BXLR, because BXLR or LR actually points to PopPC. So eventually everything that you execute as a gadget ends in PopPC. And that's really useful for ROP, right? Because
can you explain really quick that on ARM you can pop into PC? I think we forgot to say that.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So on ARM you can pop into PC, which is basically like return, right? On x86 it's a return instruction. On ARM it's just pop PC. You pop a value into the program counter. Thing on ARM is you can pop a lot of registers at the same time. Okay, and so that's our awesome pivoting, right? With heap spray and stuff. And from there it's just really assembling a standard ROP chain. So ideally you would do something like, okay, I know this is a stack pointer, so I'm going to, relatively to that, get this into a register, and so it's page aligned, and then protect it, which would be the really nice way. But we were kind of under time pressure, and so Joshua came up with this awesome technique that I will call the insanely large shellcode poking ROP chain. So we're poking the entire shellcode 4 bytes at a time with like 2 ROP gadgets each, which results in, I don't know, like 6 double words into known fixed memory locations. So there's like this, I don't know, terabytes of ROP chain that makes sure the shellcode is at some point in memory. But that gives us a known address, and then we can, protect this known address. And because the linker is a linker, it of course contains protect because it needs to protect stuff in memory. Yeah, and then from there it's just jumping to the shellcode because Android doesn't have mandatory code signing like nasty iOS has. But then again, on iOS, like we're using WebKit bugs, right? And what is the awesome only processor on iOS that can execute unsigned code? Yeah, Mobile Safari. So great. It doesn't have protect, but it does have memcopy to the JIT region, right? Okay. So there's another cool gadget that I had to share that we wanted to use because it's really, really cool, but we did not end up using it. It's one of those gadgets that you said, like, it's impossible to control all the side effects. It's going to be exploding right in your face. The linker is a linker, right? And what does the linker need to do? It links in dynamically stuff into memory. So there's this huge function that is called DL link image, which handles an ELF program section header. And if you jump into it, it's going to be expecting like the ELF header to be in R4. And there's it's a huge function, and it calls mprotect on the stuff. And there's even a free branch at the end of it. So it would be really funny, like you could have an ELF header instead of a shellcode and like a ELF program section, and the linker takes care of linking that in for you. That would have been really funny, but we didn't end up using that. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the heap massaging. Somebody's doing like a talk, massaging the heap into submission. That's a really awesome title. So with the whole RenderTree thing, it's really custom weird allocator. And those guys are going to say a little bit more about advanced heap stuff. We're just looking at use after free, which normally is easy to exploit. So what's the RenderTree, right? The RenderTree is basically so you have the document object model tree, which is everything everybody knows it from JavaScript, right? And the RenderTree is what WebKit creates from the document object model for rendering. So they're not one-to-one the same, but like if you have like a paragraph that is split in two, text, fields, whatever, then it will be two nodes in the RenderTree and so on. So it's what WebKit uses for rendering. The thing with rendering is it's composed of these, so no, pardon the different slide design. So actually these slides are from a presentation I gave in Paris earlier this year. You should check it out if you want to know more about the WebKit heap. So the RenderTree is updated a lot. Like if you scroll, if you resize the window, it always needs to create a new RenderTree, even if the document object model tree is staying the same. So it happens a lot. And because that means that these nodes in this tree are allocated and deallocated a lot, that means you need a very fast allocator. And what do people do if they need a very fast allocator? They add their own allocator, right? So what did the WebKit developers do? Yo, dog, I heard you like allocators, so I put an allocator into your allocator so you can allocate while you're allocating. So there's this awesome thing that is called the render arena, which is what they use for allocating these render objects. And how did they implement it? The render arena is really an allocator and an allocator, as in it uses malloc to allocate large chunks of memory that it will then split into smaller chunks in its own subheap. So it's called arenas, and those are allocated with fast malloc, which means if you're on like a desktop, an OS X, Safari, whatever, it's going to be TC malloc. If you're on Android, it's going to be the system allocator DL malloc. There's this rumor that TC malloc is being used on Android, which is totally not true. It's the system allocator DL malloc, which has big implications on your heap massaging into submission, right? So how does that look in the source code? They overload the render objects, operator new, to use this render arena. And since every render object a render thing is derived from that object, that means everything is going to be using the render arena for all the render objects. And that also means we're only going to end up with render objects on the heap. So if you're saying like, oh, it's use after free, I'm just going to allocate a string there and put my contents in there, that's not going to work. You can only put your render stuff in there, and that means all data you're going to control is going to be mangled CSS values, which isn't really nice for exploitation. But wait, is it really that only thing that you can control? Let's see how really allocation works, right? Allocation is basically, I don't know, it's not even first fit. It's just, it just puts stuff in this buffer without heap headers, right? So all the allocation sizes are rounded up to 8 bytes. And what it first does is see like, okay, do I have a free slot of that specific size? If so, reuse that. And for that purpose, it has a single linked list of free blocks, much like the free list in the low fragmentation heap on Windows. And if it doesn't have a chunk of the size already, it will just do simple forward allocation. So it puts this block right after the last free block. It doesn't even it just has one pointer that says like, this is the next address you can allocate from. And it does this for all the blocks. And yeah, there's no inline information to override, which might be interesting for buffer overflow, but since it's just C++ classes, there's no real overflows there anyway. So deallocation works the same way, right? You have if you're free, you have the last block is free as the first, and then the second block is free, the third block is free, which means you'll end up with this linked list. And so the first 4 bytes of every free chunk are a pointer to the next free chunk in this linked list. And there's no coalescing of free chunks. So there's 2 neighboring free chunks. There's still going to be chunks of that specific size. So they're never going to change size. And that's great for us because we don't have to worry about coalescing, and it's easier to massage the heap. So that's how the RenderArena stuff works. And I'm going to get back to that later after you guys talk a little bit about it.
Okay, we have like 7 minutes left in this thing, so we got to go a little bit speedy. We're going to talk a little bit about some more advanced exploitation topics. Do you want to just double team this again?
Yeah. Right. So he already talked about pivoting. We already talked about ROP on the stack. That's great. Can use it on the heap. The answer is yes, because although normally you don't, you just mentioned the pivots, and pivoting's pretty. I guess everybody knows about pivots now.
He's so bitter. He's bitter.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's old school. It's okay, Steve.
Yeah. So if there's nothing on the stack, how can you? The question is, how do you pivot? How can we gain control of the stack pointer? On x86, it's easy. You find 9C pop return. Yeah. Exchange EAX ESP pop return. It works like practically all the time. So this is what we want to do, right? Do. How can we do that? How can we make the SP point into the heap? The problem with ARM is even with whatever you want to call it, misaligned, I don't know, whatever, at least in my experience, you pretty much never find move into SP R0 or anything like that. You can't just find the 9C or the whatever the exchange register ESP opcode is, followed by some C3. It doesn't happen. So what do we have to do? Well,
you can use intermediary, basically.
Yeah. So like one thing you will find is that R7 is often used as a frame register, but sometimes it's not used as a frame register. So you can find a lot of code sequences that'll move R7 into SP.
And by frame register, we mean basically EBP.
EBP, it's like the ARM equivalent of EBP, but it's just sort of up to the compiler to decide to use it that way. But R7 is typically not used all that much in actual exploits, especially since if you're doing any vtable-based anything, R0 is basically usually what's going to point to your stuff because it's the this pointer. So typically, at least for C++ based exploits, I don't know, usually pivoting off R0 is where you want to go.
But it's hard to find it.
Yeah, but it's hard to find that stuff. But again, right, whatever you want to call it, misaligned instruction sequences. This is an example. We're blixing into memory map. But if we decided that it was ARM code instead, next slide shows it, we're loading out of R0 all of these totally awesome registers, like SP and LR and PC. So that's like a pivot right there. You've gained control of SP and PC. Boom, you can ROP.
That's it,
Yeah.
George?
Oh,
Yeah, we're speeding through.
Like 2
that was
minutes
great.
left. Yeah.
2 minutes, all right. So we got to use after free on the heap. We only control very, very little data, and CSS sucks for getting a lot of data there, right? So we know that the arena comes from the system allocated. So how can we use that to actually control data better? The idea is instead of doing, normal block sprays that you normally do when you use heap exploitation, what you can do is you can spray entire heaps in this case. Because the arena is a heap on the heap, which means when we're doing allocations on the heap, we can spray heaps on the heap, right? And then we free them again. And that means we control the data that is on the heap before stuff gets allocated there. And now you know why I had this yo-dog thing, because it really gets confusing, right? So what you do is on the normal heap, you spray arena-sized objects like strings that contain the data that you want to be there later. You free them again. You trigger enough arena allocations so that the arena allocator decides I need more arenas to allocate arena chunks. and it takes one of your previously free chunks, and that's how you control the content within an arena. So the idea here basically is, you can see it on this diagram pretty well. What we want to control is a virtual function table, right? And the virtual function pointer is the first pointer within a C++ class. And what is also the first pointer in a block is this free list chunk. So what you can do is without any addresses, use this arena allocator to actually move the virtual function pointer right in there of the data you control after the use after free. Because remember, if your use after free gets triggered, the chunk gets free. If the last chunk is a previously free chunk of any size, this means, or of the same size, sorry, that means that the single link list pointer will point into that free chunk. Now here comes the trick. If your virtual function pointer inside the table is beyond or bigger than the size of the specific block, that means that the call of the virtual function pointer table will go into uninitialized data. Now, here's the trick. Because we allocated the chunk before and had a string there, this uninitialized data is actually under our control. So that's how you can actually put like full 32-bit values there, control all the virtual function table, and yeah, do awesome stuff. So it sounds simple. It's pretty hard to pull off, actually. So the bonus is you can have anything in your virtual table, but you require a lot of primitives. You need primitives for allocating stuff on the render arena and freeing stuff. You need primitives for allocating and freeing strings on the real normal heap. And just creating strings does not work because of the garbage collector. Unescape, which is praised by Immunity, doesn't work anymore. It's only one single free, and we want to spray a lot of arenas. The lmalloc is a coalescing heap allocator, so we need to split it and have like blocking stuff in there and so on. And yeah, have a lot of fun debugging this with GDB, which by the way is pretty broken on Android anyway and crashes all the time. So yeah, what we needed was something better and faster than GDB, and that's what we built in-house. Not going to have time to talk about this anymore, but yeah, that's it. Sorry. Well, that's fine. So conclusion, it's actually pretty hard.
All right, so some of the conclusions, we're wrapping it up. I think we got like 2 minutes left. So we did this pretty well. We timed it up pretty well. Our conclusion is basically that the world's changing. We're in a post-PC exploitation environment. ARM is really fun. You guys should check out some ARM stuff and check out our blog and learn about ARM shell coding. And we're going to be posting a lot of the slides and materials and stuff from the course onto the blog pretty soon. And that this stuff is real, as George has proven. Like there's these Georgian JDuck actually. You guys can actually find really cool bugs. You guys can find really cool bugs and exploit them, and it's a fun new kind of territory. So thanks for listening, and that's it.